Welcome to audio highlights for Chapter 5, Gender and Sexism. Like some of our previous chapters, this chapter starts out with some definitions, and you might be surprised that these definitions for things like gender and even sex may differ from what you may have previously thought or believed. So we know that gender is determined by both biology and culture. So it's important to know that gender, unlike sex, is not the same as just what our anatomical structures or even what our chromosomes would tell us about whether we may be either male or female. And actually, that belief in terms of either one or the other is as a major misconception that our chapter hopes to bust that myth. Is the myth is that everyone conforms to what we would call binary male female system. In reality, people usually identify much more on a continuum, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Although we tend to kind of put at opposite ends of the pole, male and female, most people tend to feel like they fluctuate a little bit in different preferences or behaviors. And so, because behaviors aren't something that we can just observe in the same way that we maybe could other characteristics that define a man or a woman or a male or a female, we know that different behaviors that may be more or less common or typical among different genders are determined and usually taught by what we call gender socialization. And that starts in our society very, very early. Our text starts that it says that it can occur as early as age 2. But if you've ever looked down the infant aisle, you'll notice that even infant toys and clothes are very gender specific, and that's fascinating, I think, because of course, a newborn or even a 1 year old has no real connection to their gender identity yet, and so it does make you wonder about why our society is so adamant to have things like very feminine, traditional feminine colored clothing for girls or pink car seats and it's just interesting that our culture tends to assign gender at a very early age. And this chapter talks about how that may actually be detrimental, especially in terms of sexism, which I'll skip ahead a slide here, which is the oppression of people based on gender. So if we already know that we have these differences in power among men and women, then isn't it interesting that we already tend to assign these differences very, very early, almost from the day that we're born? This chapter also defines transgender, and there are multiple definitions that exist, but for our purposes, we're going to look at it as people whose gender identities and expressions do not conform to societal norms. And previously, transgender used to actually fall in the DSM under gender identity disorder. And since then, we have updated the DSM, and your slides were actually developed before then. So this is slide 11 talking about how to counsel transgender individuals. And at this time, the DSM-4 was out, and it actually included gender identity disorder, GID. Since then, the committees that worked together to develop the DSM, which is what psychologists use to assign diagnoses to people, decided that just the fact that someone felt as though their biological sex didn't quite align with their internal feelings about what gender they related to, that in itself shouldn't mean that a person can be diagnosed with a mental health condition. So the new term is gender dysphoria, which basically means that if you're distressed or uncomfortable by that mismatch or incongruity, then that's something that may be troublesome for your mental health. But the committees decided that in general, and advocates urged that yes, it's true that transgender individuals have a number of problems in our society, but the vast majority of these often have to do with the oppression, the discrimination, and sometimes the outright physical violence that they face from others. So no other group of people do we diagnose them because of the oppression that they face from others. So now the new DSM is a little bit more reflective of the way that we treat other minority groups who are oppressed. Your chapter does a great job of going into some things that you might want to consider if you're working with men, women, transgender individuals. It also gives you some historical context in which to understand sexism in terms of that originally the system of patriarchy was originally set to benefit both men and women. But since then, it's become quite troublesome in affording men greater power and restricting women's roles. And the patriarchal society even trickles down from years and years ago to today's actions and behaviors and oppressions that women experience in our current society. The feminist movement, our text goes through some historical three waves actually of feminism as a social justice movement. But an important thing that I want you to keep in mind when you hear that term feminist is that it's really a belief system in equality. And so if you're ever asked the question, can men be feminist or ascribe to feminist beliefs? Absolutely. It's just a belief that we are equals according to our gender. And so a man who might identify as a feminist or share feminist beliefs may work kind of extra hard to share his voice, to notice and call out examples of oppression and sexism, and just in general believe in equality between men and women. The text also talks about the mental health consequences of sexism for all of us. So this is troublesome for men and women in our society, which is why it's also motivating for all of us to work together to counter this type of oppression. We also talk about physical consequences. So the astronomically higher rates that female face of a number of negative outcomes in terms of interpersonal violence, child sex abuse, sexual assault, trauma, disordered eating. So all of these are further reasons that we need to work together. And we also have social consequences of sexism. So the fact that we undervalue women, females, or for and especially women of color, it restricts their career development. It restricts their opportunities, and there's this constant disparity in wages that you might have heard pop up lately in some social and political conversations in terms of how do we justify and why do we justify if two people are working the same job and the woman is paid significantly less. So this is another social consequence that currently in our society you might have heard some chatter about. So how do we address this? First of all, once again, this is another time that I'm going to ask you to work on your own self-awareness. So really think about your own beliefs regarding men and women. There are some great reflections in our chapter that I hope you'll take a chance to do. Specifically, spend some time doing reflection 5.1. That's on page 106. And then I also hope that you will take an opportunity to do 5.3, and that's on page 112 for me. So these reflections give you a chance to think about how your own beliefs about gender formed and what have you been your experiences and the message that you've received from society about gender development. And we know that based on your cultural background, as this chapter also discusses, these may differ. Another final point with this chapter is to also, as much as we know that sexism is a troublesome force in our society, we also know that the degree that people have self-acceptance and positive relationships, that many people are extremely resilient in the face of this sexism. So that's something that we want to bring into the helping relationship or into the counseling room or into your work as a professional, in recognizing that people are very resilient and that that's something that we can build on for future resilience. And finally, if you're wondering, we mentioned that we need to work together to counter sexism and, and how we can do that. And the chapter ends with some very specific practical ways that maybe eventually you as a professional can contribute to in an effort to promote that resilience and also just seek that ultimate social justice, which our course centers on.